You currently reside?
Stillwater Correctional Facility.
Okay. And are you currently serving a life sentence for the murder of Harry Shearer?
Yes.
Okay. And you do understand that Mr. Shearer was murdered on May 16th, 2004?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Marvin, did you murder Harry Shearer?
No.
All right. Did you in any way aid or assist anyone else in connection with the murder of Harry Shearer?
No.
Marvin Haynes on the stand in Hennepin County Court this week. A jury convicted Haynes 19 years ago for murder, and he's now asking a judge to overturn his conviction based upon brand new evidence. Thanks so much for joining us here. I'm Tim Blotz, along with Paul Blume, who's been in the evidentiary hearing all week long in Hennepin County Court. I think we need to get to the crux of this case. This is important because there's a question here of whether justice was actually served 19 years ago and whether all the evidence was laid before them to give the jurors a clear picture of what really happened and who was responsible, right?
Yeah, what a fascinating couple days in court. This is really a remarkable, extraordinary situation for a court case. This goes back nearly 2 full decades, a 2004 murder. A 16-year-old boy at the time by the name of Marvin Haynes Jr. You just saw him on the witness stand, now 35. He was convicted by a jury in Minneapolis. Certainly a different era, a different way of policing back then. Questions are being asked about that verdict.
Let's go back and talk about Marvin Haynes, because he was just a teenager at the time.
Right, 16 at the time.
Yeah.
Now 35. He was sort of described as a kid who was struggling in school, had gotten into minor trouble. Looking at some archival video from the flower shop. This is the slang of Randy Shearer, also known as Harry Shearer. Family flower shop, been there 4 decades. And you have, in just an absolute tragedy, on a Sunday morning, 11:30 on a Sunday morning, church day, up in North Minneapolis, a young man walked in to Jerry's flower shop. He was greeted by a woman, Randy Shearer's sister, at the till. The perpetrator, he would end up killing Randy Shearer that day, asked for flowers. It seemed to be a setup for a robbery. As she's making the bouquet, all of a sudden, out comes a gun. It's pointed at her, and Randy scrambles out from the back room to protect his sister, who goes running out the door. So what's interesting and fascinating about this case at this point, right, is the sister makes eye contact, verbal contact with the perpetrator.
So she's one of the key witnesses.
Key witnesses, absolutely. But she runs out the door terrified, right? What does she remember? Can she place that face when it comes time to looking at lineups and the like? And what's interesting now, 20 years later, Tim, is she's since died. So there's no going back and asking her what she saw, what she remembered. You have to rely on the trial testimony from that moment in time 19 years ago. But what's interesting is Randy Shearer had always said they were in North Minneapolis, kind of in a tough neighborhood, a neighborhood that kind of, descended a little bit over the years, and family would, friends would ask, why are you guys still there? Why do you want to stay there? They love that community. And he said, you know what? I will die protecting my sister. And then for that to sort of come to fruition, it's just heavy stuff there.
So Randy is no longer with us. Obviously, he's murdered at the scene. His sister, who was the eyewitness, no longer with us because she has since passed. Yeah. So you have to rely, again, on that whatever evidence and testimony was presented at the original trial.
Right. You have to do that. No fingerprint evidence at the scene that would ever connect to Marvin Haynes or a known perpetrator. No DNA at the scene. No surveillance video at the scene.
Because it's 20 years ago.
Well, part of it, yeah. I mean, there's some video camera from front to back room, but nothing that was, my understanding, was recording, out in the, front part of the building. So, no evidence that directly ever linked Marvin Haynes to this murder.
Did they ever find a gun?
Never found a gun. So no gun either.
No fingerprints on the gun, no ballistics that they can try and recover or anything.
No. So that's what this case relied heavily on eyewitness identification. Who did Randy Shearer's sister pick out of that lineup? And also there's one other sort of eyeball witness who's a middle school student at the time and sees basically a figure run out of the flower shop after the shooting. And so he's eventually goes through that same lineup and unclear what kind of confidence, but he also sort of IDs Marvin Haynes at that point based on what and how police presented the lineup. And the lineup...
And that's become a really key part of the evidentiary hearing, is the police lineup at the time, and was it properly conducted?
Right, and basically what we're going to get at here is the sister, Cindy McDermott, she initially picks out a perpetrator with 75 to 80% certainty in a lineup that does not contain Marvin Haynes. So she says, I think that's the guy, 75, 80%, that's what the notes say. That's the guy. She's talked about seeing someone in their early 20s, someone with close cropped hair, someone with, more educated, like the way they demanded the money and met with her. She described him as more educated. Marvin Haynes at the time has his hair out, combed all the way out, big time hair. He's a tiny kid at the time, several inches shorter than what Cynthia McDermott remembers. The hair is different. He talks different. He's uneducated. He goes to, they came out in evidence this week. He goes to a school sort of for troubled kids. And
so he wasn't as articulate as perhaps the sister described the suspect as being.
Exactly. And you know what? I think now's a good time. We have some clips of Marvin Haynes Jr. now on the stand this week, again, evidentiary hearing, talking
about what happened.
What happened and some of the evidence. And in this one, it's part of the interrogation. 16-year-old kid. He's scared. He doesn't know what's going on. And police tell him, you know what? We have fingerprints in the shop of you. We have your DNA somewhere in that shop. You really want to rely on this, or you want to tell us what happened that day? Here, take a listen.
So they're trying to force.
They're trying to force it out. Whether that's proper police procedure with a teenager. That's come up in court this week. But yeah, I think
Let's listen to that testimony now.
Because the bottom line is this: we know you were there that day because your fingerprints. Why would your fingerprint be there? I don't know, but you talking about I was there. I'm telling you, I got nothing to do with none of that.
All right, so Marvin, in the clip we just watched, an officer, second time, told you they had your fingerprints at the flower shop. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, having been faced with this information a second time, why didn't you give in and say you were at the flower shop?
Because I wasn't there.
Okay. Did you have anything to confess?
Nothing to confess at all.
All right. I covered this with the last clip, but were your fingerprints found at the scene?
No fingerprints linking me to this crime at all.
So again, just to set up that portion, the lawyer is asking.
Yeah.
Well, the police are telling you they have your fingerprints. They're telling you they know you're their guy. Why don't you confess in that moment? Why don't you tell them the truth? And he's like, Tim, I got nothing to confess. I wasn't there. And it's just, I don't know how this situation gets settled. Again, a different era. This is Judge William Cook. He granted this extraordinary hearing. Marvin Haynes Jr. is getting the assistance of the Great North Innocence Project, and they have submitted this case file that says the police work was wrong. The lineup science and what happened, that the fact that the first eyewitness initially found somebody else, then she eventually came around to Marvin Haynes, but she was shown a picture of him from 2 years before the homicide where his hair is cropped as opposed to what he was as a 16-year-old, had his hair out, picked out as he described it. And, now no ability to go back to question her, but they're presenting this evidence to Judge Cook. They spent, half of the first day. This was a 2-day hearing, half of the first day. So basically 1/4 of this whole hearing was an Augsburg University professor emeritus on the science and psychology of lineups, of photo IDs, of memory. As she was saying, could you imagine having a gun in your face, and running out the store and then your brother is shot? Can you imagine the trauma that woman was feeling? Like, what kind of photographic memory is she going to have? And if all of a sudden you're putting Marvin Haynes' photos in multiple lineups, you're bringing him out in a live lineup and calling him by first name. They didn't call any of the other people that had walked out in front of her by his first name. That's coercion. That evidence shouldn't have been allowed in, but it was, and a jury ultimately convicted on it. And his side says right now, to right the injustice, throw out the conviction, let him go home. He spent 18 years in prison already. It is a life sentence. It's a first-degree murder conviction. Now, that's another issue. A teenager, now the Supreme Court says a teenager, can't or shouldn't be sentenced to life in prison. We should relook at that. There were other avenues that perhaps eventually Marvin Haynes would get his freedom back, but now all of a sudden it's thrust this way into the courts, and a current judge will have to look back on the record 20 years ago.
You brought up something that can be important, and it is in a lot of cases. And with the case of the Augsburg professor talking about the lineups, there is research out there, academic research, to show that eyewitness testimony or recollection oftentimes cannot be as precise as what they recall. And oftentimes, in these studies have shown that, in fact, the eyewitness recollection is wrong.
Right. Yeah, and there's research,
especially when it comes to identifying suspects.
Right, and then now all of a sudden, if you throw in shoddy police work on lineups, and there was a detective who worked that case who testified. First time we've heard from him that he had raised concerns about the way the lineups were being done. Why was Haynes shown multiple times? Why did they keep trying to traumatize the sister, trying to coax? He said that she just was so distraught, he wouldn't trust kind of anything she would have selected. So he testified in this hearing. He was the only witness that didn't want to be videotaped, so we don't have, film of that. But he told the judge that he didn't like the way it was done. He had some grave concerns. He said he's done, hundreds of homicides and high-profile, cases in Minneapolis, and that is the one case that has stuck out. So for the judge to hear that, from a detective involved in the case, was quite something this week. And another, point I want to make, that sort of new evidence, if you will. Now, I think a lot of this is going to eventually just come down to this lineup. Was that so bogus? Was that so done wrong? And in the light of today's, science and what we know academically, should that just be thrown out? And as a result, either give this guy a new trial or send him home. I do think the lineup will be the key thing there. But the other interesting thing that was new was the Innocence Project lawyers called several of Marvin Haynes' sisters as alibi witnesses from that day. Remember,
and one of them was on the stand this week.
Yeah, several. So at least 4 of them took the witness stand. And they basically said they were recalling, how do you recall May 16, 2004? Obviously, the day that would change their life. Their brother was arrested, the younger brother, little Marvin. And they recall, everybody said, the church, they were going to church that day. The church bus was running late, so they had that time stamp. The bus arrived around 10:30. They usually arrived at 10. And when they left for church on that van or bus, Marvin was still sleeping. He'd been out the whole night before, kind of hanging out with some buddies. And they remember him in the house at that time. The shooting would happen an hour later, about a mile away. It wasn't a foolproof alibi, right? Because there is an hour to play with. But they were adamant. He was there. He was at home. And he was sort of sleeping, groggy. He wasn't in a position to go out and do the heinous crime that is alleged.
And we have a little bit of the testimony from one of the sisters on the stand this week. This might be a good opportunity to let us listen to that. Right?
Yeah, and the testy exchange, this is during the cross-examination. Important to note here, the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, for now, is contesting Marvin Haynes' efforts to toss out this conviction. So this is a little testy exchange between one of Marvin's older sisters and Hennepin County Assistant Attorney Anna Light.
All right, let's listen to this now.
And you did not testify at your brother's trial, correct?
No.
Were you expecting to testify at that trial?
I feel like I was 13 and we were taught that kids stay in kids' place. So they wasn't going to speak to me, and that was the norm.
And just to be clear, once you left the house at 10:30, you don't really know what your brother did after that, right?
I know he did not commit a murder.
How do you know that?
Because I know. He was at home.
But you were at church.
He was at home.
And you were at church.
Okay, folks, I got the facts. We can move on.
No further questions.
So Cynthia Haynes on the stand this week did she testify in the original trial 19 years ago?
No, none of the sisters did. That was another point, obviously, of why, you know, and again, like, excuse me, depending on what side you read this, they were all teenagers. She was 13. I think she was, no, because Marvin would have been 16. Maybe it was her, maybe she was the youngest sister. Anyway, she did not. She talked, I think, about being 13 at the time, and that the kids didn't bother, you know, with that. That was adult issues. Yeah. They kind of stayed out of that.
Yeah, she said she was 13 years old at the time.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And
you know, and there are.
So it's her bigger brother.
You're right, and depending upon the judge setting up, I mean, the judge ultimately has the final say in who gets, and he may have at that time. The judge may have ruled that no, 13 is too young to testify.
Yeah.
And the prosecutors may have felt the same way too, and the defense. So
yeah, you don't.
And we don't know.
We don't know exactly. Well, it's just not a trial I sat in on. Right. I haven't read the entirety of the testimony, the record, the trial record from that time. But it sounded like no family members. That kind of was part of the examination by the Great North Innocence Project was like, were you expecting to testify if you had this kind of exculpatory information? Why weren't you asked to come up? Obviously, also a question for the public defender at the time. The defense attorney could have had, if he had a solid alibi, why didn't he address it? So there's some people on this case, and again, important to note, I talked to Randy Shear's loved ones this week. Now, he has no immediate family members still around. They've all passed, but he's got some close friends where we're doing a bit of a longer form piece on Fox 9 coming up with them. But I've also caught up with the original prosecutor on this case, Mike Fernstall. And I'll tell you what, Tim, this is a guy who 100% has absolute confidence and faith in this conviction. He said justice was served. I'm going to over-exaggerate his language, but he basically called it a joke that there was a kind of a post-evidentiary hearing 19 years later. He thinks this is political winds blowing. He absolutely has faith, and he said, Paul, you know what, throw out that lineup, that's fine. He was still guilty. Marvin Haynes is a 16, well then probably 17-year-old when stand. Mike talked about having him on cross-examination for hours, basically tore him up, lying left, right, this way, that way, and the jury just didn't believe him. But on the flip side of that is maybe that's a scared teenager realizing his life is hanging in the balance and maybe not the greatest witness for himself. But we do have some sound. I caught up with Mike. Mike now lives out of state. Right. He joined me for a Zoom conference after the hearing wrapped up this week. And if you want to go to that sound
I do.
I'd
love
to
take
a listen to what Mike has to say.
The first thing I did is I asked him if he ever would lie to protect himself, because the judge let me impeach him with 3 instances where he gave the police a phony name to protect himself. So right away they knew he was a liar. I remember one other thing he said is that he told the police that he didn't know where the flower shop was, and I showed 4 or 5 instances where he was stopped by the police, questioned by the police, in close proximity to the flower shop. And then it kind of went downhill from there. I can't remember all of it, but nobody believed him after he was done with the cross-examination. The one thing that I find curious is that I saw in the paper that he was only on the stand for 40 minutes. It makes me wonder what kind of effort the prosecutors put in on this. I mean, I had him on the stand for a couple of hours. And for him to get on the stand and claim he's innocent, and then it doesn't sound like they did much of a cross-examination, which is kind of telling the judge that they're conceding to what he's saying.
So the original prosecutor in the case now saying, look, this was rock solid.
Yeah, and he told me, it's like, Paul, it's CSI, if you think you're going to have fingerprints, DNA, a gun, this is how we get convictions. He talks about Marvin Haynes having kind of a big mouth at the time. And there's testimony from other witnesses that, Marvin had bragged about shooting somebody, that he was going to rob somebody, and that the police had gotten an anonymous tip that said, look at little Marvin. So they kind of zeroed in on Marvin Haynes, and then that would begat the lineups and so forth and so on. Marvin Haynes, for his part, has always denied his involvement. His family has denied that he could have possibly ever have done this. It's just, being a part of it, 20 years ago, I mean, it's just heavy on all sides. You feel for, loved ones of Randy Shear, who going through hell right now, having to relitigate, thinking maybe the man who killed their, beloved friend is going to walk out of prison sometime soon. And you have to wonder whether there is an innocent man who's now sat in prison for 18 years.
And this hearing is not over yet because there's still one more witness that's going to come, correct?
Right. There was one other eyewitness, the one who basically is a middle schooler at the time, so a young kid. Again, I'm not exactly entirely clear what he sees or how he can eyeball and definitively say that's Marvin Haynes running out the door. But he basically is out on the sidewalk near the flower shop, 33rd and North Lyndale, and that he gets a pretty good look at the culprit, at the perp. And his testimony is coming. And again, this is the Great North Innocence Project that's putting him on. So in theory, he's sort of going to recant some testimony, maybe change his testimony. He's somebody who they believe can show that Marvin Haynes may not be the young man who pulled the trigger that day. And that'll be December 20th.
So after that December 20th hearing, then what? The judge basically takes all of this under advisement, and he can take his time, right, in pouring through the new testimony in this case and taking another look at the lineup before he makes a ruling.
Right. He would have to go back, although he has said he's kind of up to speed, so assuming he's read the transcript, he'll go back. He was taking fastidious notes throughout this hearing. He basically very rarely looked up, only to, something was objected to. He'd finally look up because this is his unilateral decision. There's no jury in the courtroom for this. This is just Judge William Cook sitting there, processing it all. He'll have to assess. And again, I know Marvin Haynes was on the witness stand, and that soundbite for our video camera was in court of I'm innocent, didn't do it, nothing to confess, innocent man. That's not necessarily evidence, right? It's going to come down to the lineup. Does Judge Cook kind of have faith in, okay, if that lineup was, let's say it wasn't great, does that topple the whole case? Another witness who comes forward, the police detective who changed his story, who said, I'm a little uncomfortable with the way the lineup went. That'll be an important one. And then there was one last witness I hadn't mentioned yet, a cousin of Marvin, who basically said at the time, though he said he was coerced and forced by police under pressure of being hurt himself or charged with another crime, that Marvin had admitted to shooting. And now he says that's not true. He was pressured by police. So those kind of changes, I think, will matter. Whether, Haynes on the stand himself, it's important to get it on the record, but I don't think that's the game changer here.
Paul, you and I over the years have sat in on a lot of court cases. We need to let our viewers know that evidentiary hearings like this 19 years later, 20 years later, are very, very rare. The fact that Judge Cook decided to take a second look at this case, should anyone read anything into that?
In theory, no, but we're human beings. Why would Judge Cook open the door to this? Attorney General Keith Ellison has a wrongfully convicted unit that kind of was born out of Marvin Burrell's case. And guess what? That's the same era. Guess who the prosecutor was in that case? Amy Klobuchar was the county attorney. Mike Fernstall,
who's now U.S. Senator, of course.
Right. Amy's all over the archival video we found from the 2004 homicide. She's out there, a couple different news conferences. We're going to get the guy after the verdict. We got him. Finally, justice for this family, justice for the community. Don Samuels, also a key figure at the time. He was the city council wardman at the time. And it's same prosecutor, and Marvin Burrell showed up in court to support Marvin Haynes' family this week, which was interesting because, as you might know,
was he there every day?
Yeah, he was there both days. Not necessarily in the hugest of presence. I think the first day the courtroom was full, so he stayed in the hallway. Second day he actually came into the courtroom, but he's going through his own current legal struggles. He's been since arrested after his release, but his sentence was commuted. Right, Governor Walz. There was sort of an uncomfortability. Did he do it? Did he not? Was there enough evidence to lock it down? The AP did a huge investigation on it. But it's the same type of stuff in this case. It's the same era. I think it's 2 years, difference. Marvin Burrell's case is 2002, and I think this one's 2004. 16-year-old, both were teenagers at the time. And I think to be honest, Tim, it's hard to say for this community, but I think if you open up a lot of those cases of that era, young, men, a lot of shootings, homicides, a lot of convictions, a lot of cases moving through the courts, different era in Minneapolis, Hennepin County. I think you probably could find a lot of cases that probably could be questioned on the way they all got pieced together.
The former prosecutor in this case, who you tracked down and talked to, is he expected to come back and testify to basically hold up what he did 19 years ago in the case that he tried?
Yeah, I know, it's a great question. What's interesting is he's I don't want to say this office excommunicated him. I mean, obviously, different county attorney, different era. But he said he wasn't even contacted by the current prosecutors to talk about the case. So he feels left out. He feels he's being thrown under the bus. He's been on the record and out there since the Mayan Burrell case, because again, he was a prosecutor on that one. He feels his work is being attacked, and we've got a Mary Moriarty, county attorney at this point, someone who came from the public defender's office.
Who has a different philosophy.
Different philosophy, certainly a different philosophy on it. And, we'll see where it nets out. But, there were other avenues for this Innocence Project to take Marvin Haynes' case. His sister has been an advocate, the wrongfully incarcerated. She has some advocacy behind her. She has some community pressure. The courtroom was packed with supporters this week, and she fought. She made a lot of noise, get the Innocence Project involved, and they presented enough of a case for Judge Cook to look at it. But the Supreme Court ruled on an appeal, on direct appeal back in the day. So this case has
been
technically,
appealed.
Yes, it has been appealed. It stood up, as Mike Fernstall will tell you. So here we are, and again, what Judge Cook now sees in that file. I mean, it's an awesome power for one judge to have, but
really
he has
is.
it right now.
Now, give us some insight. Is the story that you're going to put together for Fox 9 now? Because you're going to include the former prosecutor. Right. What else can we look forward to in that piece?
Well, we'll take a deeper dive on sort of the courtroom moments, the key moments you want to remember. And then, I mentioned we caught up with a couple of best friends of Harry Shearer, Randy Shearer, also known as Harry, beautiful heart. He was a singer, had a gorgeous voice, they said. They jam out, played the guitar, they went to music concerts. So we'll get a little personal, right? Because, now all
Get
of a
to know
sudden...
who the victim is.
Right. We actually went and found his gravesite at Lakewood Cemetery, beautiful location overlooking the lake in Minneapolis, surrounded by loved ones, the Shearer family plot. And one of the friends sat through the trial, one of his best friends, the whole trial. And he sees something else than obviously what the Innocence Project sees. He sees a cold-blooded killer. He said he didn't buy anything that young man was saying on the witness stand. He's sick to his stomach that a Marvin Haynes Jr. could walk out of prison at some point for what he did that day, or what a jury convicted him of doing that day. So we'll hear from him. But a lot of once I got going on it 20 years later, it was kind of interesting. I mean, we couldn't find any direct family members, of course, that are still alive, but just. There are a lot of people impacted by that homicide. That one really changed the dynamic up in the north side of that neighborhood. 40 years that flower shop had been there. And they closed. They never opened again. The family said, we're done. We're out.
And at the end of the day, what makes this story so fascinating and so important for our criminal justice system is the ethical tenet of our justice system that it's better to let a guilty person go free than put an innocent person in prison. If you don't have the proper evidence. Right. And that's kind of what this comes down to, right?
Yeah, so
and
again...
looking back at that and find, did the judicial process get this right 19 years ago?
Under the microscope now, 20 years later, this community being through George Floyd, other issues, Mayan Burrell, racial reckoning. It's fascinating stuff. And as you mentioned, December 20th, one last hearing in this case. And then all of a sudden we'll wait on Judge Cook. We'll see, we'll have to see if the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, after reviewing everything, has something to say eventually on this. And again, I think one other important point probably to make as we wrap up here, he served 18 plus years. And if you think about, I know he's sentenced to life, and it was a first-degree murder conviction, but he's a teenager at the time. Under current guise, for a kind of a heinous second-degree murder case today, you may be sentenced to 30 years in prison, and you do 2/3 behind bars. You start getting into that 18-year time frame. So he has done. Some would say he has done a debt to society that he would otherwise owe. Obviously, there are other legal issues, and you follow the law and what the legislature said about first-degree murder at the time. But he has done a pretty significant length of time, and whether that comes up eventually as the lawyers sort of sort through these last couple of days of testimony.
And sometimes the judges take that in consideration, and you and I have seen that in other cases in the past where a judge will say, okay, I'm going to re-sentence you to time already served. Right. And then release. But we have no idea what Judge Cook is going to do. So, Paul Blume, Fox 9 News, has been in the evidentiary hearing all week long. Fascinating case. Thanks so much for your insights on all of this.